Salvador Dali, pioneer surrealist, dies at 84. Article from the New York Times by John Russell, January the 24th, 1989. Salvador Dali, pioneer of European surrealism and for more than half a century one of the best known and most bitterly contested figures in the international art world, died yesterday at Figueras Hospital in Figueras, Spain. He was 84 years old. The artist had been hospitalized for treatment of heart problems 3 times since late November and had used a wheelchair since suffering burns in a fire in his home in 1984. Dali will have a permanent place in the history of art. When still in his 20s and in competition with some of the most gifted artists of the day, he made an inventive and enduring contribution to European surrealism. Max Ernst and Joan Miró, to name only two, were at the top of their form at the end of the 1920s. But it was Salvador Dali, with his meticulous and persuasive visions of a world turned inside out, who brought home to the public at large the full potential of surrealism. More than anyone else, he made his audience believe that nonsense could make the best sense, and the most memorable sense, too. He was the master of the outrageous. As he grew older, Dali became known to an even larger public as an inveterate irritant, a tease who never gave up teasing and a prankster who made headlines for decades. He was a master of what was once called the aristocratic pleasure of displeasing, and it was a pleasure of which he did not tire. With Louis Buñuel, he produced 2 surrealist films, Un Chien Andalou, 1929, and L'Âge d'Or, 1931, which will live in the history of outrage. But it was not in Dali's nature to play Gilbert to someone else Sullivan, and in general he liked to work on his own. So successfully did he do so that by the end of his life there was hardly a department of design he had not strayed into, or a lucrative use for his name that he had not explored. This latter proclivity caused André Breton, the self-appointed leader of the Surrealist movement, to rearrange the letters of Salvador Dali to spell A Vida Dollars. Despite his commercial activity, Dali never stopped painting and drawing, and in 1980, the Pompidou Center in Paris mounted a retrospective that included 168 paintings, 219 drawings, 38 objects, some 2,000 documents, and a specially built Dali environment. Dali also had the joy in his last years of seeing a Dali museum opened in Figueras, in northern Spain, just a few miles from his home, in the little seacoast village of Port-Ligat. Salvador Dali was born in Figueras on May the 11th, 1904, the son of Salvador Dali, a lawyer, and his wife, Felipa Domenech. He showed a precious gift for art, both in Figueras and at the National School of Fine Arts in Madrid, where he began his studies in 1921. He impressed immediately as one of nature's winners, a student who could turn his hand to anything and bring it off. But he also impressed as a troublemaker. In 1924, he was suspended for a year on suspicion of inciting the students to revolution, and in May of that year he served brief sentences in jail in Figueras and Girona for anti-government activities. Welcomed back to school in Madrid in 1925, he was expelled for good a year later after refusing to take an examination in the history of art. Meanwhile, his lifelong facility allowed him to paint and draw in a wide variety of styles, both ancient and modern. Dali's international career began in 1928, when he went to Paris and was made welcome by Breton and the other members of the surrealist group. The group at that time was in need of a recruit who could explore the labyrinth of the unconscious and would not be deterred by Breton's dictatorial ways. Dali went back to Spain and painted the pictures that were to make him famous. The best of these are as impressive today as they ever were. Dali had a way of overturning reality that was not merely whimsical. When he did strange things with the human body, they were things that play upon people's most private fears of illness and incapacity. When he did strange things with objects, they were things that made those who saw them feel that the world as they knew it had suddenly vanished. The observer was adrift in nightmare, but the terms of that nightmare corresponded to disquiets that most people prefer not to admit to. The unconscious preyed on the conscious in these early paintings of Dali, as a tiger might play with a fat white rabbit. So it was not surprising that Dali returned to Paris as the anointed favorite of Breton and the natural successor of those earlier favorites who, like Ernst and Miro, had proved too independent for the inner councils of the surrealist movement. His first exhibition in Paris at the Galerie Guémon in 1929 was as successful as anyone could have wished. Unlike his predecessor in the surrealist group, Dali produced mirror-like images that at first sight conformed exactly to the convention of traditional oil painting. There was nothing he could not do in the way of exactitude. When the occasion called for a representation of a landscape, a seascape, a skyscape, a beautiful woman, a loaf of bread, or an expensive watch, he did it to perfection in a style that was all reassurance. Only after a closer look did it become clear that the watch had gone soft like overripe camembert, that very peculiar things were happening to the beautiful woman, and that it would be a mistake to put too much trust in the lyrical perfection of the land and the sea and the sky. He painted realism for the unreal world. When Dali hallucinated in the late 1920s, the whole world hallucinated with him, not least the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where James Thrall Soboy was later to say that Dali had portrayed the unreal world with such extreme realism that its truth and validity could no longer be questioned. The Americans saw in Dali both a winner and a doer. Where the other surrealists remained essentially private people, Dali was born a performer, a man who needed an audience and responded to it. He found that audience in America, and for many years he kept it impressed and amused. He was a dreamer, but he dreamed for a particular reason. He wanted, in his own words, to systematize confusion and to discredit the world of everyday reality. He did this in his paintings, but also in his life. Asked to lecture, he turned up in a diving bell and insisted on speaking from inside it. Asked to contribute a three-dimensional object to an exhibition, he sent along a life-size taxicab inside, which rain fell throughout the duration of the show. He specialized in the poetics of disquiet, and until well into the 1930s, he produced idea after idea that captured the popular imagination. He had his first New York show at the Julien Levy Gallery in 1933, and from 1934 on, he was a familiar figure in this country. He talked, he wrote, he perfected his public appearances, and he had glamour of a kind that now has to be manufactured. In his case, it was an amalgam of mischief, high spirits, idiosyncratic looks, and an advanced instinct for professional advantage. With his popping eyes, his upturned and perfectly waxed moustache, his sober but perfectionist taste in dress, and his large collection of canes, he was an unmistakable figure. He went on painting pictures that pressed hard on the nerve of their time. He was very good on sexual anxiety, for instance. He was very good on the idea that civilization might suddenly go to rot. And he was very good indeed on the idea that war, civil war above all, was the ultimate pestilence and the irremediable crime against humanity. It was possible to argue, as George Orwell argued in 1942, that Dali's paintings are diseased and disgusting, and any investigation ought to start out from that fact. Yet it can also be argued that at his best, Dali wrote out a declaration of independence for the human imagination in a way that it is still valid. His soft construction with boiled beans, premonition of civil war, of 1936, remains one of the most extraordinary documents of its date, epitomizing all the savagery of the imminent Spanish Civil War. But Dali was not always at his best, and in later years his best became rare to the point of invisibility. Lucrative but fatuous concerns took up much of his time. His nimble intelligence seemed to wear in a vacuum. Where once his fancies had a universal application, they became more and more a matter of merchandising, though Dali never ceased to have a grandiose idea both of his stature among living artists and of his mission as the redeemer of modern art. At 45, he wrote in 1948, I want to paint a masterpiece and save modern art from chaos. Dali turned to the church, whereas in former years blasphemy had been high on the list of his preferred instruments of terror. He turned to the church in the late 1940s and began to treat traditional religious subjects on a large scale, and with dexterous attention to effects of perspective, lighting, and levitation. These did not please critics and historians, but undeniably they won him a large new public that asked for nothing better than to see the events of the New Testament recorded in Dali's blandest and newly saccharine style. His Crucifixion was given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Chester Dale in 1955, and his Last Supper is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. In August 1940, Dali moved to the United States, where he put his manifold gifts to every conceivable advantage. He turned up on Broadway, in Hollywood, in store after store, on Fifth Avenue and elsewhere. He designed for opera and dance. But whereas in the 30s he had both an intuitive awareness of the way the world was going and the wit to say something memorable about it, in later life Dali was the prisoner of Dali. He did not think so, nor did the large public who followed his activity closely. He gave interviews on every possible occasion, and no audience was too silly or too small. He was never at a loss for something startling to say, and quite often there was just enough truth in what he said to make it quotable. We surrealists are not artists, he once said, nor are we really scientists. We are caviar, and caviar is the extravagance and the very intelligence of taste. And again, the main idea of my collection, he said when he went into fashion designing, is to do away with breasts. Breasts are only in the way, no matter what the situation. My solution will be to make women look like angels. From now on, breasts will be worn in the back and will be collapsible. With the aid of a helium tank, they will rise when we wish them to do so. When asked for his opinion on art, Dali never failed to say something outrageous. Nothing gave him greater pleasure than to make mock of current orthodoxies. Cézanne is very popular at the moment, he said, but in time to come Meissonier will sell for much, much more. Cézanne's work is just so much caricature. He is the clumsiest painter I have ever come across. Well, there you are, he would say after an outburst of that kind. You've got your money's worth. Time's up now. As Dali saw it, he never stopped growing and experimenting. In his last years, he looked to science for fresh inspiration, and while other famous artists were content to repeat themselves, he worked with holograms, the stereoscopic 3D image, and many other technical innovations. If people found these experiments both empty and overblown, he was ready to rebut them. All his life, he remained the man who once said, "At 7, I wanted to be Napoleon. My ambition has been growing steadily ever since." Dali was married in 1935 to the former Elena Diaronov, universally known as Gala. She had previously been married to the French poet Paul Éluard and had also had an association with Max Ernst. There were no children of the marriage, which was one to which Dali referred continually, both in his work and in conversation, as an ideal union. After her death in June 1982, at the age of 88, Dali spent much of his time in a remote castle in Pubol, in Catalonia, that he had given her some years earlier. His last years were marked not only by failing health, but also by rumors and the recrimination about the abuse of his name, his signature, and his artistic output. It was alleged, among other things, that many thousands of sheets of paper bore a legitimate Dali signature but were otherwise blank, facilitating the addition of images that, whether or not by Dali, would be worth a lot of money. On a good day, it was said, Dali could sign 4,000 such sheets. After quarreling in 1974 with Peter Moore, the Englishman who for many years had managed his business affairs, Dali fell into reputedly unscrupulous hands. His copyrights and reproduction rights were said to have been sold on a worldwide basis in ways that gave him no share in the profits. Reynold Morse of Cleveland, for many years a friend of Dali and a collector of his work, formed an organization called Friends to Save Dali in 1980. Mr. Morse said that thanks to untender care by Dali's wife and to the terroristic methods of his Spanish business manager and former secretary and bodyguard Enrique Sabater, Dali was being defrauded of much of his income. An apotheosis at the end. Never one to give in easily either to misfortune or to infirmity, Dali issued a statement to the press in March 1981 that began, "I declare that for several years, and above all since my sickness, my confidence has been abused in many ways, and my wishes have not been respected." Though much trivial or inauthentic work still bears his signature, Dali, toward the end of his life, enjoyed something of an apotheosis in his native Spain, thanks both to the friendly concern of the Spanish royal family and to the success, in 1983, of a major Dali retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Madrid. In his prime, Dali was not only an artist of intermittent substance, but also a man whose wit, style, panache, and readiness to take on all comers in conversation added to the gaiety of more than one capital city. To the day he died, he was, as he would have wished to be, a subject of controversy, though in recent years the controversy had more to do with the activities of his associates than with creative powers that had subsided long ago.